那么那个상황을 야동아 자시비에 섬주시와의 잡지도
First of all, I would like to offer a warm welcome to all of you. Today is the third day of our teaching on the origins of the secret mantra. And yesterday, as I mentioned the other days, in the discussion of in order to discuss the origins of mantra, it is important to discuss the history of Buddhism. This is because the secret mantra Vajrayana is a subset of Buddhism. And in order to discuss the origins of Buddhism, the land where Buddhism first developed is the noble land of India. And so it is important for us to know a little bit about the history of Indian civilization, or of the country of India. In order, once we know the ultimate origin of the secret Vajrayana, then we can see that the secret mantra Vajrayana has sources and a basis. And we can also understand many of the important points, or the crucial points, the reasons for practicing the secret mantra Vajrayana. However, in our monasteries and nunneries, we aren't able to discuss all of the topics of education, in particular, all the different subjects that are taught in schools. And we don't teach all the topics that are taught in ordinary schools. And so I thought that this time I would follow the general way that contemporary historians describe things. And I think that if I do this is actually something that is difficult for many Sangha members to understand. And I think it's a little difficult for the Sangha members to understand. But if we continue just saying, oh, I don't know, then it's not okay. And we just end up without any basis or any support. And then eventually within our monasteries, and so I think it is important for us in our monasteries and nunneries to take a certain degree of interest in history and contemporary educations. So because it's like our Sangha members need to, our Sangha members not encounter the difficulty of not being able to keep up or being left behind in contemporary education, because otherwise, when we need to get along with other people, if we don't understand the way things are done, or we will be unable to actually go along with or progress with other people. And so that is the reason why I've been working hard to try to discuss this. And so I think there's a reason and a purpose for doing this. So I think it is important for all of us to begin with that sort of an understanding. So now I'll continue with the teaching. So as I said the other day, we can talk about Indian history and in 4 periods, or 4 eras. So we can divide basically into 4 parts. The reason why we're dividing into parts is because it's several thousand years of history of India. So if we all take it as one piece, it's hard to understand. If we divide it into sections, it is easier for us to understand. And so for that reason, yesterday I mentioned that I would divide it into 4 periods. And so today we've come to the second period. And the second period is what we call the Vedic period. Even within the Vedic period, there are 2 parts, the early Vedic period and the late Vedic period. And this is because the Vedic period is also rather long. And so if we don't make a subdivision of it into 2 parts, then it's difficult for us to understand it. So when we're speaking about the early Vedic period, the first thing we need to understand is that when the Vedas first appeared, the culture was first being started or being formed by the Aryan peoples. And at that time, the Aryans did not have a written language. And they didn't have any writing. They had their own original language, as I mentioned before. They came from, they gradually or moved in stages from Central Asia to India. So they had their own ancestral language. And when they arrived in India, they developed what we could call the Vedic language. As the Vedic language developed, then what it became is what we call the Sanskrit language. And so this is the hypothesis of most scholars. When we talk about the language of Sanskrit, when did it arise? Sanskrit probably first developed in the 7th or the 6th centuries BCE. So when we're talking about the early Vedic period, there was no written language. But at that time, so how did they study the Vedas and the Vedic literature at that time? It's by oral transmission. So one would teach the other orally, and that is how they were transmitted and preserved. At that time, there was no tradition or custom of writing them down and teaching them in that way. So when we look at if we need to study the early Vedic periods, and so what are the texts that we can study? Then the main source is the Rig Veda. There's basically no other historical source than the Rig Veda. Now this Rig Veda, what is written in that, or what is described in the Rig Veda? It describes the ways the Aryan people fought battles after they had arrived in the area of Punjab and settled there, what their culture was like, how they studied, and so forth. And so these and other aspects, many other aspects, are taught in the Rig Veda. Now, what is the reason why they're called Vedas? When we talk about the word Veda, so in Sanskrit, it's called Veda, right? And the word Veda now has become very widely used. And so most of you have probably heard the word Veda or Vedic. And so what among the Vedas, what is the Rig Veda? Among all the Vedic literature, then it is the earliest of the Vedas, and the Rig Veda is the earliest of the Vedas, and like the source for the other Vedas. Now, the Rig Veda speaks about many topics, and it has a very vast scope. So, as I mentioned the other day, there is no actual specific historical document about the time of the Rig Veda and the times of the Vedas. So, what there are is, if we want to study the Vedas before the 4th century BC, then what we have is the studies, and we have the two great epics. And as I mentioned the other day, the two great epics are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Those are the two epics. And so basically, we have the Vedic literature, so the Vedas themselves, and also the two epics. Basically, these texts are essentially the only way to learn about ancient Indian culture or knowledge or how Indians thought at the time and so forth. So they're like the indispensable documents for all of us. So now I'd like to speak a little bit about Vedic literature in general. Now, as I mentioned before, the word Veda this is a Sanskrit word, and the word Veda it has many different meanings. Among all the different meanings, though, the main meaning is that it means knowledge. Please wait a moment. So it basically means Veda. And so since it means knowledge, since it basically means the word Veda has many different meanings, but it primarily means prajna, or wisdom, or knowledge. The Vedas believe that the Vedas originated that the ancient sages were blessed or came under the power of the gods, and they came out just orally from the ancient sages. It's like the Gesar epics in Tibet, people who haven't ever had any education, or they don't know how to write, they don't know how to read. And there are these bards, and they and while they're leading their lives as they're caring for livestock and so forth, as they're going, they fall asleep when they're herding animals, and in their dreams, they have dreams about the events of the time of Gesar. And then when they wake up, and then a few days later, they become a little bit unhealthy. They feel a little sick. And once they get better, then they recite they just, without thinking at all, without any hesitation, they recite the text of Gesar as if it's been reciting, playing a recording. It just comes right out as if it was, and the words they're able to say the words really clearly. Now, actually, they don't know how to read. They've never had any education. and yet they recite, volumes of texts of Gesar epics from their memory. And so the Indians believe that through the power of the gods, the ancient sages were able to just recite them out of the power of their mind. And that is what they believe. And so for this reason, the word Veda means come from the power of the gods. So if we practice the Vedic texts, then we will be able to develop unexcelled wisdom. And so that is why they're called Vedas. They're what help us gain wisdom, gain knowledge. And so that is the history. Now, when we talk about the Vedas, and take a deeper understanding of them, and we talk about the Vedic literature. And we talk about the Vedic literature, then it's not just the four Vedas, but there are also many other compositions or texts that can be included within this category. So to show you all now, it is like this. So the Vedic literature has three main sections, and the first is called mantras or samhitas. Now, these are the root texts of the Vedas. They're the fundamental texts or root texts. This is the Brahmanas. Oh, no, my pronunciation is not good, but Brahmanas means what we'd say in Tibetan. I think we could probably say the Sutras of Brahma or the texts of Brahma. That is probably how we would say it in Tibetan or in English. And the third is the Upanishads. It can mean like, this means either staying, it has many different meanings, or staying nearby or staying respective. I've never seen it actually translated into Tibetan, so it's better to just use the Sanskrit word. And so basically, if we think about the Vedic literature, then we're talking on a larger scale, and we call the Vedic literature. Now, the actual Vedas, or the root texts, are what we call the mantras or the samhitas. So that is this portion that is the actual root text of the Vedas. And the second and the third sections are like commentaries on that. The Brahmanas, which we'll speak about later, I will give an expression there later, is primarily about rituals. And the Upanishads is primarily about the philosophy of the Vedas. So if we talk about the Vedas on the larger understanding, we can say that there are these three categories of Vedic literature. Now, even within the Vedas, what are the actual Vedas? It is the first subsection, the mantra, is this first section that we call mantra, and it is also called samhita. But basically, it's a collection of hymns or praises. So what later scholars called is the root text of the Vedas. So we couldn't really call them. So we call them the root Vedic texts. Now, these four Vedas, or the four root texts, are the earliest texts in the Brahmanical religion of India. So I think many of you have heard the word Vedas. When I was young and we studied when we studied the areas of knowledge, then there's a lot of discussion about the collection of the common areas of knowledge, which include the Vedas. And so I think many of you have heard about the Vedas. So what are the four Vedas? When I talk about the four Vedas, so basically in terms of the texts, there are the four texts. And the first of these is the Rig Veda. Now the Rig Veda is the earliest and the most important of the four Vedic texts. So in Sanskrit, it is called the Rig Veda. Now the second is called the Yajur Veda. The Yajur Veda is called in Sanskrit the Yajur Veda. And even within that Yajur Veda, it also has two parts. And the Krishna part and the Shukla parts. So I'm not sure how to pronounce these, but basically it's the light and the dark. And if you divide it into two, so we can say there's the light Yajur Veda and the dark Yajur Veda. Now the third Veda is called the Sama Veda. It's called the Sama Veda, the Veda of melodies or chants. Now the fourth is the Atharva Veda. Now the Atharva Veda is the name of it. Now, among the four Vedas, the Atharva Veda is the latest of the root Vedic texts, the one that appeared at the latest time. And so, in general, when we think about the four Vedas, what many people think of them is that they think of the Vedas as thinking that from the very beginning there were four of them. And that's what people think. They think that they couldn't be separated, that at the beginning, there are all four from the very beginning. However, if we look at it in terms of the historical or the factual terms, the four Vedas did not all appear at the same time. There is an order in which they appeared. And in particular, in terms of their meaning, there are some divergences or differences in their content and meaning as well. But in general terms, however, the basic framework or this basic way that they're constructed, the four Vedas are the same. And so the four Vedas, supplement each other and they kind of augment each other. So what is unclear in one is clear in another. Or they fill in what the gaps, or they augment each other. And so they're connected in this way. So basically, when you think about the four Vedas, developed over the course of several hundred years. They were gathered over the course of many generations, and in the end, they were all compiled into one, and that is in the end what became the four Vedas. It was not like a single person wrote the four Vedas all at the same time. Now, however, when the Vedas first appeared, no one talked about there being four Vedas. At the beginning, there was only the Rig Veda. Now, the time when the Rig Veda appeared, if we estimate it, it was probably composed or compiled during the period from 1500 to 1000 BCE. And so what is this Rig Veda? It is it's primarily a collection of hymns or praises or melodies or songs in praise of the gods. It is compiled of many of these. There's probably over 1,000 different sections of songs, and there are probably over 10,000 verses. If we divide the whole text into books, then it is in 10 books. Now, when the Rig Veda firstly appeared, it was not written down. At that time, there was no writing, and so because there was no writing, they couldn't write it down, right? So when the Rig Veda first appeared, it was not written down in letters. It was primarily translated orally, memorized. One person would teach it to the other, and so that is how it was maintained. For it's like we have that in our homeland. There are like old people who don't know who are illiterate, but they can still recite Tara. And how that happened is that our grandparents taught it to the parents, and the parents taught it to the children, right? And even though they're illiterate, they know how to recite the Tara praises. And so the Vedas are taught in the same way. But the way this is transmitted in Tibet and the way it's transmitted in the Vedas are very, very different. The reason is that the Vedas because they took a great interest, the Brahmins took a great interest in preserving the pronunciation exactly as it was. So we can see this in Sanskrit. It's a very complicated language, especially in terms of the pronunciation and the sounds and so forth. And the reason is because the Vedas in transmitting the Vedas, they're very preserving the pronunciation and all the aspects of the language very exactly. And so for example, so like when we recite it and memorize and transmit things in Tibetans, we don't really worry about whether the pronunciation is clear or not. It wasn't like that with the Vedas. The way they memorized things and the way they recited texts, they took great care over the pronunciation. They had a very strict manner of doing this, and they had a sequence that they studied it in. So basically, when we talk about the Rig Vedas, it wasn't written down at first, but eventually, as is transmitted from one person to the next during the later Vedic period, and then only at that time was it all compiled. Now, of course, there were some differences. When one person transmitted to another, and they transmitted to there were some differences. They collected and they compiled them all, and they corrected all the variations, and then only at that time did they write them down in words. And for this reason, when we had there was the great Chinese master Yi Jing, who came in the 7th century AD. He went to India at the end of the 7th century. And there is his text, the record of Buddhist practices sent home from the southern seas. And he wrote there that he says, they were all transmitted orally and not written down. And the Brahmins with the sharpest minds could recite 100,000 verses. So what this shows me is that at that time, when he went and saw the Indian Brahmins would recite the Vedas, they memorized the Vedas. And we talk about reciting. We talk about, and in the Indian tradition, it said that when they talk about reciting, it said you memorize something and then recite it. Now, when we talk about reciting, it's like you're looking at the words and reciting the text, and that's not actually the reciting. When we're talking about reciting the words, and so the original Sanskrit word means to translate with your mouth, means to recite a text that you have memorized. And so all of the Vedic texts were recited orally from memory. They didn't write them down. So those Brahmins with the sharpest minds, the most intelligent, were able to recite like 100,000 verses from memory. And think about 100,000 verses. we've got the Prajna Paramita in 100,000 verses. It's like being able to recite that 100,000 verse sutra all at once. So they were able to recite that many texts. They had great abilities to recite. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone could do. This was those the most intelligent, those with the sharpened minds, who were able to recite 100,000 verses. And so at that time, in old times, the Indians were very intent upon memorizing texts. And so for that reason, in our Vinaya, we talk about needing to recite text from memory. It's discussed frequently in the Vinaya. And this is basically related to Indian culture. That's because they had such great interest in reciting text from memory from the past. And this is really beneficial. Because there are many invasions from outside, right? The invaders would come and they would destroy a lot of Indian cultural artifacts. But if you haven't memorized the text, if the texts are burned, then it's a huge loss. But if people have been memorized, even if all the texts are memorized, you'd have to kill all of the people who've memorized it. Otherwise, you can't destroy the text. And so this is a particular feature of memorizing texts. So in particular, in the Vinaya, when we think about the reasons to the memorizing the Vinaya, if you can clearly understand all the stories and the reasons for the different rules in the Vinaya, then you can immediately know what you are allowed to do or what you should do in any given situation. If it's something where you have to look it up in a text, then you aren't able to be completely independent. You always have to bring your text along. You have to say, can I do this or can I not do this? And you look it up, that's not okay. And so I think this is a kind of a crucial point. Now, that was just a little bit of a digression, but in brief, the main point that among the four Vedas, the Rig Veda is the earliest and like the basis for the other Vedas. So it's like the basis for all the other Vedas. Now, its collection or meaning is that it's like a collection of hymns to nature written by the Aryas. It's like you could say hymns to gods, but at that time, the gods were primarily at that time, they recognized the natural phenomena such as the heavens and the earth and the sky, the storms and the rain and so forth as gods. And so then they'd write praises of them in collection, make this collection of the hymns. And so how we know this is that in the other three Vedas and the Rig Veda, there are many citations from the Rig Vedas. And so that because of that, we can understand that the Rig Veda was like the basis for that. So the Rig Veda is an extremely important text. So the most important ancient Indian text is the Rig Veda. Likewise, if we want to research Indian religion and mythology and so forth, then the Rig Veda is like an important and indispensable historical source. For this reason, then in the 19th century, a German scholar and who is well versed in very difficult. This German scholar in philosophy. Now, his name in German is, I think, Deussen. When we talk about Deussen, it's difficult to say it in German. No matter how much I try, the German pronunciation is difficult. But anyways, in any case, what this Indologist Deussen wrote is that there's no way to know Indian philosophy without knowing the Rig Veda. So basically, if you don't know the Rig Veda, then there's no way you can talk about Indian philosophy or Indian religion, as he said. And I think this is really seems true. There's reasons why he said this. The reason why he said that is that the Rig Veda is the Whether we talk about the philosophy or the gods or whatever we need to speak about in terms of Indian philosophy or Hindu philosophy, the root of it that it all comes down to is this text, the Rig Veda. And so we absolutely have to know this text. So if the Rig Veda is so important, well, who was the author of the Rig Veda? Well, if it didn't have an author, who was it who made it? Is there someone who made it? So generally, one thing we need to know is that when the Vedas first appeared, at that time, there were no distinctions in caste as there are later in India or currently in India. And so for that reason, no matter who you were, anyone could perform sacrifices, anyone could sing praises, recite the hymns, or pray, and so forth. Later, after the caste system developed, then not everyone was allowed to do that. A few of the castes were allowed to make sacrifices and recite hymns and so forth. There are other castes that were not allowed at all to perform sacrifices or recite the hymns. But at that time, anyone, no matter who they could, was allowed to make sacrifices or recite hymns. Now, everyone could do this, but of course, there are differences in people. There are always, right? Sometimes in terms of their education, in terms of their skills, in some respect, are different than other people, right? And so there are a few people who are always a little different. And so among these different types of people, and they're basically within the society, there's a few people like this. And so these are the people who wrote the Rig Veda. And so these authors of the Rig Veda, if we translate it into, are called the Saptatsaya. If we translate it into English, we'd say the seven nobles, the seven noble beings. Basically, seven people. As I'm basically saying, it was compiled by seven people. You could also say the seven sages or the seven noble ones. So we can call them the seven sages. Now, we say that this is written by seven sages, but when contemporary researchers examine this, they say it probably wasn't written by seven people. When examining the text, it was probably compiled and collected over the course of many generations, over the course of several hundred years. And so it's basically a compilation of texts written by many people over several hundred years, not by just a few people. In particular, in ancient Indian tradition, they were all the same. The people of the same the people of the same tradition would have the same family would all have the same names. So, for example, someone like a sage would write something, then someone in the family could use that same. And so the name said that it is a single person, but actually it was written by several generations of the same family. So when you talk about these seven sages or the seven nobles, are people of the same familial lineage who wrote the Vedas. Now, of these seven sages, people have respected them especially highly because they're different than ordinary people. And in particular, when the Rig Vedas first appeared, they came up from the blessings of the gods, like our Gesar epics these days. People who would just all of a sudden be able to recite them out from memory. And so these people said that these must be people who had direct connection to the gods, who had special abilities and respected them highly and revered them. And so for that reason, they're called rishis or sages. Also, that is what the origin of the word rishi, or sages in English. So what this shows us is that at that time, anyone could perform sacrifices or perform rituals. Anyone could make offerings to the gods or offer praises to the gods. Anyone could do it in any ritual. Everyone was allowed to do it. It wasn't like the later Indian tradition. However, when you're doing a particular sacrifice, a really complicated and elaborate sacrifice, you needed someone with experience and with the knowledge and the skills to be able to perform that service. For example, when they're performing a sacrifice for their own to the gods for their own purposes, they had their own lama. It's called a purohita. We call it later in Tibetan. It's called the purohita. So these were the clerics who later would be stayed by kings to give it to advise the kings. One aspect was to advise the king. The other was to perform sacrifices to the gods on behalf of the king. So they needed a priest to perform these functions. And any king absolutely had to have a purohita. And you couldn't have just any other person for that function. You had to have someone with the education and the experience, and to have that status of the royal priest. Likewise, with armies, you also needed a special person to conduct rituals and sacrifices in order to ensure victory in battle. So at the very beginning, everyone was allowed to do ritual sacrifices, but when you had to do a special or a collaborate ritual, you would have someone who was specifically trained or specifically learned in doing this. And so they had to have special people. So what happened from that is that gradually that is how the Brahman class or caste developed. So the Brahmana class began from that, because these are people who had specifically studied the Vedic rituals and the sacrifices, and that was their job, to particularly perform these sacrifices. And so there's that caste developed, and gradually this became what we call the Brahmin class. And then gradually the Brahmin class said, we're the highest level, we're really good, and the other castes are not as good. And then gradually, because of that, there was the distinctions in the class. So that's how it began. But at the beginning, there was no castes. But the different ranks of the class, which in general came from that, developed through that way. Likewise, when they're first developing the Vedas, there were no temples. At that time, there was no custom of building temples. In the place where there was no fixed place where you had to perform a sacrifice, like a particular ritual building or someplace where you need to do that. In the end, there weren't any even figurines or statues, any representations of the gods, whether written, painting, or whether sculpted, or whether carved. And there were no such figurines of the gods. Likewise, the sages who wrote the Vedas. So later, when we talk about the sages later, then there are people if you look at the mythology, they seem like people who are like really completely different than ordinary people, superior to other people. But actually, they're ordinary people. They had families. They had belongings. And at that time, every household every family had a head of the family, and the head of the household had the person who's primarily was usually the father, or if there was no father, it was the eldest son. And so the oldest son, that head of the household had the responsibility to perform sacrifices, perform rituals. He was the one who had to do it. If there was a war and they had to go to war, he was the one to go to war. And if it was necessary to do agricultural work or farming, he had to do that. So he had to carry all three responsibilities. He had a lot of work. So at that time, in terms of work, when there's the beginnings of the caste system, at first there are people who different jobs, and because of having different jobs, they gradually developed the caste system of higher and lower caste. But at that time, there was no the caste distinction, so a single person had to do many different people. One person had to perform sacrifices and do the farming and so forth. Everyone did everything, and so at that time, there was no distinctions of high or low castes. That developed later. Now, as I mentioned before, when the Vedas first appeared, the authors or the compilers of the Vedas were the seven sages. So now these seven sages became very well known. Now, among these seven sages, there are two who are most well known. Now, one of them is named. This is named Vishvamitra. So Vishvamitra. So one of the sages is called Vishvamitra, and the other is called Vashishta. And so there are these two sages. So these were the greatest of the seven sages. And I think that their names are in Tibetan, but I couldn't find them. And I thought, if we can't find an attested source, it's not okay to just make it up. So for that reason, I'm just leaving them in Sanskrit. Now, at the time that these two sages appeared, at the same time, there was a king at that time, and his name was Sudas. This probably means well seen, or now this king Sudas was a very well-known king, very famous king. And he respected both of these two sages very highly. He revered them highly. So he looked up to them quite a bit. But as we have the saying, to say the saying, in a single land, you can't have two kings. Two kings in a single land can't together. The same as if you have two tigers, they can't live on the same hill. One will say, this is my area, and the other will say, this is my area, and they'll fight, right? And similarly, the two great sages, the king treated both of them well, and so the two of them fell out with each other, and there were many disputes between the two of them. And their descendants also developed different views, and there's many disputes between them. And sometimes they even had fierce battles, but they don't need to speak about the details. But later, what people said is that, so later people would say that the sage Vashishta is in the Brahmin caste. And Vishvamitra, the sage named Vishvamitra, was in the Kshatriya class, or the royal class. Now, at that time, there was no distinction between the Brahmins and the Kshatriya class. But later, and during the time of the later Vedic period, at that time, after the caste system had developed, it was explained in this way as being a different caste. But in any case, these two sages were extremely important. And later, as I speak about other situations, then we will mention it's possible that I will mention these two sages again. Now, in any case, at the same time as the two sages, there's the king, King Sudas. Now, if you think about King Sudas, he was a very important historical figure from that period. And the reason for that is that at that time, when the Aryan peoples were living in the region of Punjab, were not a particular kingdom like they are today. It's like in our country, you have clans or you have different tribes. So in each of these tribes or clans, each of them had their own leader. But at that time, the king Sudas was the most powerful chief and the most he was the chief of the largest and the most powerful of the tribes. And then at the area of Punjab, there was often a lot of fighting between the light-skinned peoples and the dark-skinned people. So the light-skinned people were the Aryans, the same as Europeans these days. They're light skin and had like blue eyes, it is said, right? When we talk about that, if we think about we say that the Buddha himself was also from an Aryan person. He was like a Westerner. He had like a light-colored skin and blue eyes. Something like a very tall and a strong person, right? As it said. Now, the dark-skinned people are the indigenous people who had been in the area before the Aryans arrived. Now, their skin was darker in color and they were shorter. And their noses were flatter. And so for that reason, and so the Aryans would criticize them and scorn them as saying that they had no nose. Their noses were flat. So it's like the same as having no nose. And it seems like the Aryans had very large noses with very fine form, fine shape. So the indigenous people of this area had a darker complexion. They had a flatter nose. And so for that reason, the Aryan people scorned them and called them the noseless people or the barbarians or the dark-skinned people. They used they called them by many different epithets. And so there were many fights between the two of them. Even within the light-skinned people, so even within the Aryan people, there are many different disputes between them. They're always fighting. And so the king Sudas, what his job since he was so powerful, he was victorious in all the different regions. And in particular, at that time, there were different tribes or clans of the Aryan light-skinned peoples who became very envious of him because he was rich and powerful. And they thought, well, we'll all need to get together and to oppose him. And they did this. And but that the king at that time, the king was very skillful and he was able to defeat all of the people. And so he first subdued all of the disputes within the Aryan peoples. Not only that, he also worked hard to preserve the literature and religion of that time as well. So he worked hard to do that. And at that, as I mentioned, the two sages before, the king also protected and supported the two sages I mentioned before. And so for that reason, the Rig Veda text and other literature and important literature, and so there's a reason why I was able to remain extant for so many thousands of years is because of the support and the protection of this king Sudas, it is said. So that is how we have to describe it. So now I think we need to take a break here and we will resume in half an hour. So I will continue. As I was describing, the hymns in the Rig Veda are primarily about worship of the nature, the sky, the earth, the clouds, and so forth. These are what were considered sacred and recognized as being gods. Viewing the nature as having a divine character, and so there are hymns in praise of nature. If we think about it from another perspective, when we think about the Rig Veda, we can say that there are hymns in offering to all the gods, and many different, a collection of many such hymns. And so when we say all the gods, if we're talking about all the gods, then there's no choice but to speak about the myths or the stories of the gods and the gods. Now, the Vedas speak often of the gods, and researchers these days have many different opinions about the reasons or the functions of these, but in general terms, when human civilization was first developing in this world, in that time, the origins of human civilization, or at the time, the way we think about things, or the time that our capacities of thought and so forth had increased to a certain degree, the way people thought was that all the things in the natural world had feelings like human beings or life like human beings. And that is what they believed at that time. And the powers of the things of the natural world were greater than the powers of humans, they believed. And so if we think about it from the perspective of a human, when we're talking about a myth or speaking about the gods, it's talking about humans' wish to understand their hopes and their fears and their wish to understand and seek the truth of the situation. And so the myths mix in the feelings and hopes of many different people. So that's one way of looking at it. Now, another perspective is that the myths or stories of the gods describe what the environment was like at that time, what the climate was like, what the customs of the society were, the nature, what the situation in the society was. These are all expressed in myths. And so for this reason, the myths and the stories of the gods are very crucial for study into the history and the culture. So when we say myths, some people think that they're pointless and meaningless, but it's not that at all. Actually, myths are extremely important for the study of culture and society. In particular, when we're talking about the study of religion and the philosophy and understandings that are connected to religion, the study of mythology is indispensable for this. Now, the reason for this is that the mythology is like an aspect, the appearance of the original religion of human. It's like the original nature worship of humans is expressed in the mythology. Or it is like a form of the original philosophy. And as it developed, the philosophy became even more developed and became more complicated. But at the very beginning, it was kind of like the level of people's thinking. When that level had not reached such a degree, they thought about things in a rather simple way, and it was expressed in the form of mythologies or in terms of seeing the nature gods. And so when we research the Vedas, and in particular when we research the transmission of the stories in the Vedas, then this is extremely important for the study of Indian history, Indian religion. So studying the Vedic literature is the same as studying the origins of India. And also the Vedic literature also has a different than, and they're like the ancient Greek myths. There are many ancient Greeks, and even ancient Rome, there are many different myths. But all the myths of the ancient Greece or Rome are dead. I mean, the myths remain, but there aren't any people who practice them or believe them anymore. However, the Vedic mythology is still like alive. And the reason is because there are people who still worship all the gods who are described in the Vedas, people who still believe in the Vedas. So the stories from the Vedas are like living myths. The ancient Greek and Roman myths are like dead myths. They've already become old. I think there's nothing wrong with describing it in that way. So when we talk about the Vedic mythology is really important to note. And if you don't understand that, then if you say that you know Indian philosophy without knowing those, that's a rather audacious statement. And Buddhism is also an important Indian philosophy. It is a philosophy and practice that developed in India. It is absolutely certain that there is a strong influence. There are many different levels of influence of the Vedas in Buddhism, in particular within the secret mantra Vajrayana. There's a great influence from the Vedic literature and the Vedic myths, and we can understand this clearly. For these reasons, it is very important for us to know about the Vedic literature. When we talk about the Vedic literature, the texts of the Vedas, and we research into them, so who were the gods at the time that at the time of the original Vedas? It was like aspects of nature appearing as gods. It's like they look at the sky, and the sky is huge. It's vast. Right? It's infinite. And they think it must be extremely powerful. And must think there must be some sort of a god there. In particular, the sun is really strong, right? Because of the sun, crops can ripen. Basically, the sun is, indispensable for all sentient beings. You think that the sun is just not some sort of thing. It must be a god, is what they thought. You'd think that, right? That's how they thought, right? They were like the scientists of that time. You'd say, what is the sun? What does it do? Well, it ripens crops. It gives us warmth. And so it definitely has some sort of power. It must be greater than humans. And so gradually thinking in this way, they took a particular aspect of nature and called it a god. And it's similar in the Tibetan and Himalayan peoples in particular. Even today, in the Himalayan regions in Tibet, then many people still have a similar way of thinking. For example, we consider most mountains to be gods, right? You say on the top of the mountain there's a god, on the down slopes of the mountains are the gods. If you see a tree that's old or particularly and you say, oh, there must be a god there, there must be a naga there. Actually, whether there's a god or a naga there, we don't know. We can't see. But when these are spoken about in the folk stories, then we think, oh, there must be something there. So many people think of this as being superstition. This is like superstition. There's no God there. Saying there must be a God there. We think that it's just out of ignorance, believing out of ignorance, and there's no point or no meaning to it. However, but if we think about it from another perspective, in the old era, when thinking of viewing the nature as a god or looking at the natural environment as being living, as being alive, when we identify it as being alive, that power is greater than the power of humans. And the ancestors understood how we had to rely on the natural environment, and so they understood how we had to preserve the natural environment, how we needed to care for the empowerment. And so this is something that's very important in the traditional ways. Now, these days, what happens is there's a view of natural gods, or looking at considering the natural environment important, is thinking, oh, that's no point, and do whatever you want. You think that everything is for people to use, and it's okay for people to do whatever they want with it. And so this has led to great environmental destruction. We use everything, we destroy everything, we take everything. And so our environmental problems in this era they're something that we absolutely have to face up to and look at because they're so critical at this point. And so this shows that our ancestral way of thinking about the natural environment has real value and has real importance. Now, I don't need to speak about that too much. In any case, within the Vedas, there are many different gods. And so if we need to speak about each of the gods, we just couldn't speak about them all. But if we divide the gods into different groups, then I think it's easier for you to understand. But when you divide the gods into groups, at the beginning, there weren't any distinctions in the classes of gods, but later, then later in the 5th century BC, then the gods were divided the Vedas were divided into 3 classes or 3 groups. So what these 3 groups are the gods in heaven is the first. So those in heaven. The second are those that are in between or in the air, and then those on the earth. So those are the 3 levels. Now, within each of these 11, there are each of these 3, there are 11 in each. So in total, there are 33. And so we talk about the gods of the 33, right? So that is where this question arose. Now there are many gods who are not included with these three classes or 3 levels, but among these three levels, all the most important deities are included in these 3 classes or levels. And so we'll take this division into three levels. And I will now give you an introduction to some of the most important gods in this. And so first I'll begin speaking about the gods in heaven. And in this class, I thought I would speak about four different gods. And the first of these is Deus. Deus. How do you read it? Deus or Deus? I don't know. How does it? I don't know it. It doesn't know us. In any case, that's the first one. The second one is Varuna. And the third is Vishnu. And the fourth is Ushas. See, these are the four. These are all considered gods in heaven. So the first of these is Deus. When you talk about Deus, what he is probably, if we were to translate his name into Tibetan or into English, we'd call him the god of light. So the god of light is a very important god because he is the progenitor of all the gods, the ancestor of all the gods. And not only that, the Aryan peoples, as I described yesterday, originate, as I said, they originated in Central Asia, as I mentioned, right? And when they left, at first in Central Asia, they were the same, and some went to the west, some went to the east, and as I mentioned the other day. And so the Aryan peoples, there are many different groups of the Aryan peoples and all that, and they all worshipped this god, but they said his name differently. Like in Greece, it said Zeus or Jupiter, Deus, Atu, Zeu, or Jovis. He had many different names. Though he was called by many names, it was one god. So this Vedic god, Deus, I looked for an image of him and I couldn't find it, but for Zeus, Zeus is the king of the gods in ancient king mythology. He was the main or the king of the gods. And so I found a picture of Zeus and put it here. They're the same. The name is different, but the essence of the god is the same. And the same god. If we talk about the essence, sometimes it becomes strange. If we talk about essence and form, it's different. But here, it's the same god given a slightly different name. So in this god, there are many different peoples who worship this god, or who worshipped this god. And for this reason, scholars hypothesize this god was a god whom all the Aryan peoples worshipped before they split into many different branches and went to different directions. So the Aryans in India worshipped this god. Those who went to the west believed in this god. And even later Greek mythology, he was the main god. In ancient Roman mythology, he was also the primary god. And so for these reasons, this god was a god who was worshipped by the Aryans in general before they separated into different groups. But after the Aryans arrived in India, first they considered this the oldest and the progenitor of the gods, the main god or the king of the gods. But that faith gradually decreased. And in the end, this god lost his position to other gods. In the beginning, he was the main thing. He was the king, and later they demoted him and put another king, considered him another god as the main god, and didn't worship as much the god who had formerly been the chief of the gods. Similarly, when we look at it, it's what it says in the Rig Veda is that, and so what it says in the Rig Veda is that this god and the earth goddess united and became the god Dyasprithavi. So the reason why the heaven and earth joined together is that the people at that time thought that all of the gods came from a single family. So this god is like the progenitor, the ancestor of all the gods. So if he needs to, and so if all the gods could originate from him, then he had to have the nature of both heaven and earth. And so that is the introduction to him. Now the second god, I will introduce the second god. And you all will know, because we always, when we were talking about the Chasum, the torment 3 parts, or when we are doing the Long Mahakala ritual, he appears in that. We talk about Varuna. And so Varuna means the water god. And so in Tibetan, we call him the water god. And so on the top, there is the god. And can you identify with it? It's a crocodile. So the idea that a crocodile is that, now the ancient Indian, they didn't know how to draw crocodiles properly. And so what happened, it's a very long animal, because they didn't know how to write such a long flat animal, because they couldn't draw it. And what happened is that the neck became very long, right? So we write it with a very long, and then the back part is made very short. So later we say this is a water creature, but we didn't know that. When people show us what a crocodile is, we wouldn't reckon. We say crocodile, but we call it a crocodile. We can see the crocodiles that we can see in Rinpoche. So we didn't know that the Tibetan Chusin was actually the crocodile, because the Tibetan Chusin has such a very long neck and a very thin, and the proportions were all changed. It was very strange. It became a very weird animal. But this is an okay drawing of a crocodile. So the idea is that it's a crocodile. And so this water god Varuna is also a god who has been worshipped from ancient times. And the reason we're saying this is that some appeared later. Sometimes the worship of some gods appeared later. But some gods have been worshipped from ancient times, from the time that the Aryan peoples arrived in India. And so Varuna is from the ancient gods. So what type of a god is Varuna? When you hold the sky to be a god, then Varuna is the gods. The sky or the space permeates all things. So people say, this is huge, it must be a god, and they called it Varuna. And they named it Varuna and believed and worshipped it. And this god is the most has the greatest magical powers, because he's sky, and he's the sky itself, the space itself. Is nothing that is more pervasive or more powerful than him. So no matter what area of the world you go to, or no matter what thought any person might have, Varuna knows it all. He knows it all because he's looking from down from above, right? He knows everything. What the Aryan people thought is that it's like that he was like the judge of karmic cause and effect. the person who kind of regulated good behavior, the person who judged our good behavior. And so for this reason, his role is to take interest in and limit and restrict human beings and to promote the good behavior. So that is the role of this deity. Similarly, some modern or contemporary researchers, what they say is that we always talk about like the Chakravarti, the universal emperor, right? And we think that the idea of a universal emperor probably came from this god. There are people who do think that this is how it happened. Now later, this deity's qualities, all of these qualities were later transferred to another god. And Varuna was kind of demoted. He was brought to a lower level. So who were his qualities transferred to? It's the god Indra. So his qualities were then transferred to Indra. And that's what they say. So in the basis, in the beginning, if we talk about it, originally, Varuna, when he was worshipped, then Varuna was a really powerful, pervading all things, and knows all humans' thoughts. Is a really incredible being, and that essence of God and the God that we speak about in the Christian religion at the very beginning are very, very similar. If the way people believed in or worshipped Varuna had continued or increased, then it's possible that in India they wouldn't worship many different gods, but they'd become a monotheistic religion, worshiping one god. And so the reason that this didn't happen is because the tradition of worshiping Varuna declined. You could say that it declined, or that you could say that what people thought is Varuna is so powerful, so all-pervading, and who knows all the other people. This is just too powerful. He's too serious. There's no point for this god. There's no particular feeling for this god. He's just too serious. He's too high, too lofty, too far away from us. There's no point in that. And so for that reason, this god gradually, people thought we don't really need him so much, and so he gradually lost importance. And so people started to ignore him. And then after that, what happened is that gradually, in the Rig Veda, what it says is that this god is said to always cause rainfall, because where does rainfall come from? It comes from the sky. So the god is the sky by nature, and since the rain falls from the sky, later what this god became is that first he was the sky, right? Is the sky in the form of a god, and later there's not so much discussion of his being the sky, but many discussions of being the rain, and so it became the water god. So later, even in our secret mantra, when we're doing the Torma in 3 parts, the Chasum Torma, the Torma in 3 parts, one of the gods is Varuna, right? So this is, but this is him. Now there are too many gods. They're all crowding and waiting in line. So I can't say too much about them, but we're not sure if the gods are going to be happy. They're thinking they're taking a long time. It's my turn now. And if they're going to get offended, we don't know. So I better go through them quickly. Following this is the third, is Vishnu. So you probably all know about Vishnu, right? In Tibetan, we later called him Kyamchuk, but he's called Vishnu. Now the Tibetan word Kyamchuk And the reason he's called Kyamchuk, or entering pervasively, is because he was able to cross the sky in 3 steps. The sky is huge, right? But Vishnu had great power. He was able to cross the sky in 3 steps. He only had to take 3 steps. And so for this reason, he's called Kyamchuk, or so his name means that he can, in Tibetan name, means that he can cross the entire heavens in just 3 steps. So at the beginning, Vishnu was associated with the sun. He had the power of the sun. At the beginning, as I said, in the beginning, all of the gods were related to things in the natural environment. So Vishnu was the first associated with the sun. Now, in the Vedas, he was not considered so important, but in the Vedic literature, Vishnu was not considered so important. But later, there were the Puranas, a type of text. There's a category of literature, and within that, Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, these 3 became the 3 main gods and considered the most important. But before that, Vishnu was not all that important of a god. So basically, in brief, Vishnu's essence and characteristics gradually changed. At first, he wasn't much, but gradually he changed and became one of the great gods. But before that, Vishnu was just a god who'd crossed the sky in 3 steps. But other than that, he was not such an important god. And so, what are these 3 steps, though? The 3 steps are like related to the sun. And the reason why they're related to the sun is that the sun first rises in the east, and then it gradually comes up to where it is at noon, at the zenith at noon, and then in the west it sets, right? It disappears in the west. And so they took that as an example. So the 3 steps, the first step is that he takes a step from the east. The sun rises in the east, right? So he takes a step from the east, and in the second step, he arrives at noon, at the zenith at noon. And then in the third step, he arrives in the west, where the sun sets. And so in 3 steps, it's like you're taking 3 steps. And so in the early morning, the sun arises. At none, it's a zenith in the center of the sky, and in the end, it sets in the west, and so that is how they identify the 3 steps. However, but there's a particular, when you reach to the center of the sky at noon, what people believed about the center of the sky is that at the point where we get to the center of the sky, at that place, was where the gods lived. So the gods lived where the sun came at noon. And our ancestors, the ancestors of humans, after they died, also lived there. They lived there in great happiness. And so all our ancestors are up there with all the gods at the center of the sky. It's like they're all enjoying themselves, having a big party. So after everyone died, they thought that after people died, they'd be reborn in this place. This is the ancient belief. So for this reason, the people of that time, he was like one whom people had the greatest help for. It's like us thinking we want to be reborn in the realm of Sukhavati. Now, at that time, there's no question of the Sukhavati, but if I could come to the center of the sky where the sun comes at noon, where all the gods and our ancestors are enjoying themselves, if only I could be born there. So this is their greatest aspiration, was to be born in this place. And so for this reason, Vishnu became more and more people in people's minds. And the reason for that is because he went to the center of the sky every day, that place that was so important. And so he is therefore important because he is the one who we need to worship. He's the one whom we need to praise. And so Vishnu's status or his level gradually became higher and higher. It's like thinking, can we become like the sun? Can we become like Vishnu and be able to get to that place at the center of the sky? And so in order to get there, they sang many hymns, many praises of Vishnu and made up many offerings to him. So generally, the sky and the sun and all the gods of the heavens are either related to with the sky or with the god. In many cultures, ancient cultures many ancient cultures, the most important gods were related to the sky and the sun. This is something important that is important for us to understand. Now, the fourth god is this. The fourth god is for the first time, now I can finally show you a goddess. They've all been male gods up to now. So now I get to show you a goddess. Now, this goddess is named Ushas, the goddess Ushas. When I say Ushas, what she is when at the beginning, before the sun rises, there's dawn, and there are all the colored and all the colorful clouds, the colors of the rosy fingered the rosy fingers of dawn and so forth that appear. And so what people would say, so when the sun rises, the sun, it's really beautiful. It's really wonderful. So it's probably something to it. And they would identify the beautiful dawn as a goddess. And this goddess is also a very ancient goddess. She's not a later god. She's a very ancient god. And how we can know that she is such an ancient god is, and she's not only in the Vedas, she is also in ancient Greek mythology. In the ancient Greek language, she's called Eos. And in Latin, she's called Aurora. The name Aurora is actually a commonly used word now, right? So this word Aurora is also derived from the same word. So Aurora in the Greek, Eos, however you say it, and I don't really know ancient Greek. I don't know how to speak Greek, but Ushas all come of the same linguistic origin. Now, in many cases, as I said before, what this god is when the Aryans were living in the area of Punjab, the area of the Five River Basin, every morning when the sun shone, the appearance of dawn was really beautiful and really attractive. And people thought that when they saw that such a beautiful appearance, then the Vedic poets were like unable to resist offering the praise. They could say, I just can't help myself but write a hymn. Even if they thought if I couldn't do that, they were unable to resist, and so they'd write poems. Like really describing the dawn, a really living and emotive feeling. It's like it's a very living and emotive poetry. And so gradually this became this goddess. And so that is how this goddess originated. Now the powers of this goddess, the dawn rises in the sun, right? And so it's like she opens up the sky in the east, and she removes all the all the darkness, and she was also able to eliminate all the perils of demons and darkness. And so that's the main function of this goddess. And so in the Vedic literature, the praises of this goddess are like the most beautiful and expressive praises. And they said, and so basically what they said in ancient days was that that the hymns of this goddess were the most beautiful of the poetry, and also they're among the most numerous. Because the Vedic poems, when they saw this beautiful appearance of the dawn, at first in the beginning they didn't have much feeling, but as soon as they saw it, they have this like inspiration to write poetry. And immediately they just wrote many words and many lines of verses without thinking much. And so the praises of this goddess are so beautiful, and they're also very numerous. It is also said that this goddess is like a friend of human friends. She's like a friend for all human beings. And her expression was like always like a young maiden. It's not like she was like she wasn't like some old woman. She was like for always, eternally. She was like youthful, and so she's always smiling, and her body never had any appearance of aging or of deterioration. And she was also the person who limited the human lifespan. She's the one who limits into how long you can stay. So that's what she's the goddess who did this. So as I explained before, in the Vedic literature, the most beautiful poems, compositions, those with the most beautiful poetry are the praises of Varuna. But the hymns with the most beautiful imagery or comparisons, and the nicest words, the most beautiful words are the hymns for this goddess. And this isn't only in Indian literature. The hymns and praises offered to this deity are like incredibly beautiful songs and poems, really lovely praises. So that completes it. So next we have So I've spoken about the gods of the heaven. So now we're talking about the gods in between, or the gods of the air. So this is the second section, the gods in the air. Now here I'm only going to speak about 3 of the gods in the air. The first is the god Indra. In Tibetan, we call him Gyajin. And the second is Vayu. And the third is Rudra. These are the 3 gods. So to first speak about Indra. Now, the god Indra, I think most of you have heard about Indra, especially those of you who have been to India. He's a very important god in the Vedic literature. Because the god in the Vedic literature who has the largest number of hymns devoted to him is the god Indra. And so we can see how much the people of that time venerated this god Indra, because there's so many hymns dedicated to him. We can understand how much love they felt for Indra. Likewise, during the Vedic period, Sagata is not quite gapped into this. Indra is also like the most powerful. He's the most important. The one who is most adored by the people. And what people also at that time believed is that Indra was the god who protected the people of India. So that is what people of the time thought. Now, near India, there were the Persians, right? You can call them the Persians. We call them Persians. So there's also the ancient Persian culture, the Zoroastrian. They also had faith in the fire gods. And what is written in their they call that Indra is actually an evil god. He's a god of darkness. But in the Vedas, he's said to be a very important god, right? And in our Buddhist text, then Indra became the lord of the gods, Gyajin, or the Indra, and became the one who maintained the Vijaya, the palace. And it also said in the in the sutras that he's like the king of the gods who lived in the heaven of the 33 in the divine palace of Vijaya. And so basically, if we look at all of the praises in the Rig Veda, a quarter of the hymns are praises of Indra. So we can see how much he was revered. But still, it's difficult for researchers to clearly identify what Indra's origins are. We can say, like, some say that he was originally a god of the sky. Some say he was a god of the, Varuna was a god of the sky. Ushas was a sky of dawn. But it's we can't clearly identify which aspect of nature Indra was originally associated with. But when we look at the words of the hymns in the Vedas, Indra has qualities of the gods of the heavens, qualities of the gods in the air, and qualities of the gods on the earth. So it is really difficult to say which of the three levels of the heavens, the air, or the earth he's on. It's hard to say. But in general, when we think about the one thing that is often said is that in the earth there are the storms, right? Rainstorms. When there's rainstorms, there's a lot of storms that are really powerful. And they say that he was a manifestation of wind and rain in the atmosphere, or of storms. And so he's probably related with rain and strong winds in the atmosphere. And another particular aspect of him is that when the Aryans is a god who is that was only worshipped by the Aryans who came to India, not by the Aryans who went to other areas. So this is for this reason it said that Indra is a special god of India, or a god that after the Aryan people left their homeland, arrived in India, once they arrived in India and came to the area of Punjab. So before that time, previously their most important god had been the sun god. When you get to Punjab, India is really hot, right? The sun is extremely hot. Because it's so hot, you might think, oh, the sun's not so great. The sun is too hot. We need to worship the sun god, but he's really torturing us. It's just too hot. It's really torturing us. We need to choose some other god, worshiping the sun god, and there's less worship of the sun god. And then their object of worship was trained to for the gods who could bring rainfall or wind and clouds. And so because they're so hot, they had difficulties. And so when if someone could give some wind and rain, then that was great. And so the adoration they felt for the sun god was then transferred to the gods of wind and rain. So in brief, when we talk about Indra, became one of the highest status among the gods. But he was not a god who was there from the very beginning. He was not an old god, as I said. Some gods appeared later, right? Some people had, the Aryans had already worshipped when they came to India. But Indra is probably a god whom they started worshipping after they arrived in India. In any case, Indra was extremely powerful god. He was the most powerful of the gods. So the god who had the most strength and power was Indra. And also Indra really liked drinking the intoxicant soma, or alcohol. he was the most powerful, but he wasn't, the best god. He didn't really, he drank a lot. He drank a lot of alcohol. He could drink. He became until he drank as much alcohol as the more he drank, the stronger he became. And then he would be able to defeat and destroy everyone. Later, he didn't. It's not because at the beginning he wasn't that well behaved. He liked to drink. The second is that he liked to fight in battle. So to talk about drinking and fighting in wars, if we consider in terms of humans, we don't think of that as being someone who has such a good character, right? But he was really powerful because the weapons he carried, like lightning and arrows and hooks and so forth. And he'd be on a golden chariot. There'd be a golden chariot that's drawn by two horses, and then around him they're the Maruts gods, like this army of gods. And so like this henchman. So and he would together they would fight the king of the demons named Vritra. Likewise, when Indra would defeat all of the barbarians who invaded India. So sometimes I think about it. We have a lot of stories about the gods and the demigods fighting. And I think it's probably not so different, actually. At the time that they were in India, the Aryans, and then there are the original inhabitants of the region, the dark-skinned peoples. They'd say, those are the Nagads. The Aryans say, we're the gods. And when there were, and because of the armed conflict between them, then I think that's how the fights between the gods and the demigods happened, or the gods and the non-gods. So normally we think the gods and the demigods, the gods on the peak of the Mount Meru and the demigods on the slopes of Mount Meru, and we think that they all come together and fight. Of course, that's possible, but maybe the struggles between the gods and the demigods may well come from an aspect of ancient Indian history. In any case, this god Indra was gradually promoted and gradually became more and more important. And then he became the lord of the gods, Indra. And basically then, Indra was a god, the god of storms, and the protector of God. He was the war god. And so basically we call the war god, or in Tibetan they would say the Trahla. He was recognized as the king of gods. So later, Indra later became more and more important. And in the end, among the three gods, he became one of them. So there were three. Later, there were three. There was Vishnu, Shiva. Oh, so no, he wasn't one of the three. Just in any case, Indra. That's basically how Indra came to his present form. Now, I'd like to talk about. It's better to keep going here. There are too many gods. The second god of the air is Vayu, or the god of the wind. So Vayu. So he's also in the Torah in three sections. He's the one who's said to ride on the wind, right? So this is him. So Vayu. So there's Indra. So he was like Indra's assistant, his helper. He was always with the audience. So like Indra had this golden chariot. So Vayu always accompanied him in the chariot. And his main job was to cure people's illnesses and to grant long life. That was his primary function. So this is Vayu. The next is Rudra. So Rudra is the storm god, the one who brought wind and rain. When we have like strong winds and rain, right? That the god of that is Rudra. In the Vedic literature, there are hardly any hymns in praise of this god. But later, this god, the storm god Rudra, became extremely important. What he became called, how important he became, is that gradually as he became the Maheshvara, the great lord of the gods. So at the very beginning, there wasn't any. And eventually, he became called the god Maheshvara. And we talk about many gods becoming the Maheshvara, but among them primarily, Rudra became the nature, the essence of the great, most powerful Lord of the gods. And so he's one of the most important of the three great Indian deities, so he's extremely important. Now, this god Rudra, his features or his qualities or whether they're talking about humans or livestock, he's the one who had the power to send diseases, but he had to send diseases, but he also had the ability to cure them or heal them. So he was very complicated. He was the one who could send the illnesses, and he was also the one who could eliminate them. And so for this reason, people believe that on the one hand, he was the one who sent illness, and he was the one who cured them. So like storms are really important. So because that reason, and that's the reason why Rudra became called the Bhairava, the terrifying one, because he was such a terrifying god. And so for that reason, he was called Mahabhairava, or the terrifying one. And so he's a really complicated god. On the one hand, he had the powers of love and compassion to cure and heal illness. And another aspect, if you think about it, is the one who gave humans, who harmed and caused a danger for humans. He was a really difficult god. In any case, this god eventually became the great god Maheshvara. At the beginning of the Vedas, there was no such god, Maheshvara, or Lord of gods. So those are the gods of the air. So I've talked about the gods of the air, and now, I'll speak about the gods of the earth. I don't know how much time I have, but maybe the time is. I'm not sure how long we've gone. Well, anyways, I'm going to talk about the gods of the earth. I'm going to speak about three of the gods of the earth. And the first is Agni. And this is Agni, the god of fire. The second is Soma. And the third is Prithvi. And that's how you should probably say it. So these are the three gods of the earth. Maybe it's better to speak about them tomorrow. So I'll speak about them tomorrow. Otherwise, it'll be too much. There are too many deities. If I say too much at once, then we'll just kind of be too much and we won't know what we're saying. So I won't speak about them now. But here are the main things. I spoke about the four gods of heavens, the three gods of the air. And so I've given you an introduction to them. And so tomorrow I'll give you an introduction to the gods of the earth. And after introducing all the gods, it's also among them. I'll also talk about the Yama, the king of the death. And after introducing all of them, then I'll begin to start speaking about the later Vedic period. But there's a lot to say about the Vedas. I think that I should speak about them in 2, but it might take 3 days. There's an awful lot to say about the Vedic period. Then after we've spoken about that, then only then will we begin to start speaking about the Buddhist period. So you all might be wondering, he's saying he's going to speak about mantra, but he's speaking only about Hindu lists. talking about all these Hindu gods and all these Indian. He doesn't saying anything about secret mantra at all. He hasn't even said a single word about this. I'm saying this in order to be able to get into the discussion of the secret mantra. If we can understand this a little bit, then when we get to the topic of Buddhism and the subject of mantra, then you say, oh, that's what this is. Oh, this is what he's speaking about for. And I think it's possible that you're going to be able to find some understanding there. And so we will leave it there for today. And so now we'll recite our prayers.